Hello mate, and welcome to another exciting episode of Get Rendering, the series that's going to get you up and running creating good renders as quickly as humanly possible. Now, from what we built on in the last episode, we've got a few places we can go, so I'm going to make this as productive for you as is humanly possible. Quickly before I get started though, huge thank you to everyone for subscribing and hitting the notification icon. That really helps me out. And of course, an even bigger thank you to my members and patrons. Your names are going to run across the screen at the end of the video. For information on how to support the channel, check out the description down below. So let's jump into this then. In the last episode, we learned about adding lights and cameras and objects into our scene. But now I want to talk quickly a little bit about composition. But before we jump into that, I want to talk about this toolbar at the top here in the middle. This is the toolbar that you're going to be using for various different functions within your ren'py scene, and we've got the WASD button here, which allows you to move around your scene using WASD, funnily enough. And then if you want to reset your view, you can just hit this circle with the upright arrow in the top right hand corner of your viewport, like that. What we also have is this icon that looks kind of like a thumbstick icon, a circle with 4 arrows pointing north, south, east and west in it. And what that allows you to do is click in your scene and move your camera around using your mouse, and then you can use WASD and you can it's almost good, move around as if you were in a first-person shooter. It is very clunky and it gets worse the more stuff you've got in your scene, but an empty scene like this, it's not too bad. And then obviously reset our scene by clicking on that icon there again. The rest of the icons are very specific. Moving from left to right, we have the selection tool. This is the node selection tool that allows you to select a specific node within the scene. Node being a thing, basically, it's just an unnecessarily obscure term. Then we have the universal tool. Now, what the universal tool does, if I quickly pop a cube into our scene, just as we did before, going to use the defaults, cube, one size, one division, accept. What I can now do in my scene is select the cube, and what you're seeing is this tool here. What this tool does is it allows you to move and to rotate and to scale your object in all 3 planes at any given time. Now, personally, I would recommend never using this tool, purely because it is far too easy to accidentally misclick and rotate something when you didn't mean to, when you were just trying to move it, and then you have to Control Z. And that's just wasted time. It's far easier to just go, I want to rotate my object, so I'm going to click on this icon instead, the one next to the universal tool, which gives me the rotational widget, and then that allows me to rotate along X, Y, and Z. Now, what you're going to notice is, as the object rotates, the widget remains in the same place. And if I click on the blue circle in the middle, it allows me to rotate along all 3 planes. So it creates kind of like a hand-on-ball method of rotating, kind of like a, what do they call them? Those little balls that you used to get instead of mice, roller balls. Now, if we look at our other screen where we have tool settings, what you're going to see is that there are options to choose from, and this is a contextual menu. So currently I've got the rotate tool selected, as you can see, active tool rotate, and then the subject below it changes depending on what tool I've got selected. So if I were to change to the translate tool, you can see that the options have changed slightly. If I change to a completely different tool altogether, like the geometry editor tool, sorry, you can see that the options are dramatically different. So what I'm going to do is come back to our rotate tool. The first option is use world coordinates or use local coordinates, use object coordinates, screen coordinates, or use world coordinates with local rotations. World coordinates, having that selected, is what's causing our widget tool to remain as it is in place rather than rotating with the object. If I choose use local coordinates, what you'll find is that now our rotate tool actually changes with the object as it rotates. Sometimes that's a really good thing. Most of the time, you're probably going to want to leave it in world coordinates because you're building your object around your scene, or rather you're building your scene around your object, so you want everything to be relative to everything else. So if I put 25 degrees on the y-axis on this, I want that to be 25 degrees with respect to the rest of the scene. And that's entirely up to you how you do it. You can change it by using these sliders over here on the right hand side, so you can change your X, rotates on your positions like this. You can change your scaling so that it's 100% in all of those. You can literally bring it back to default there just by changing the values in the parameters tab, but that's just another way of adjusting things. Now, one of the cool things that I do want to show you is if you're using the move tool, I'm going to bring my menu back on here. What we can do is we can enable snapping. And what snapping allows us to do is actually place objects perfectly together. So because I'm using a 1 meter cube, I'm going to leave my snapping on 50 centimeters. And what that means is that I can maneuver my object around by 50 centimeter increments, and it's always going to snap. Now, for using 50 centimeters or 1 meter is going to have a similar effect. The only difference is that 1 meter is going to mean that for every time it snaps, it's going to snap 1 grid. Whereas at the moment I've got it snapping half a grid. But what this means is that if I were to create if I was to duplicate this object, let's just duplicate the node. We've now got 2 cubes in the scene. I can position them perfectly side by side, which is really handy if you're building a set or a complex object out of simple shapes. If you're building a little Minecraft world or something, they're all 1 meter by 1 meter squares. You can use this to snap them. Now, obviously, the majority of the time, you're probably not going to be using snapping, so just remember to disable it once you've finished it. Otherwise, things are going to get a little bit wacky. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete that cube there, and then I'm going to reset my positions to 0, 0, 0, just so it's nicely in the middle of the screen. And then if you remember from the last episode, I've got 2 options. I can click on the reset view, which resets me to the default position for the perspective view of the camera, or I can home in on the object itself so that that becomes the center of the object. In this case, you can see the widget at the origin of the widget becomes the center of my camera's focus, so I'm rotating around that, which is nice and simple. So there we go. Okay, so do yourself a favor, have a bit of a play with the tool settings for each one of these options. We're going to briefly touch on what they do, but the actual tool settings I'm going to leave you to figure out, because the easiest way to work these things out is not to watch me sit and talk about them, is to just have a play yourself. So what we have here is the scale tool. As you can see, the widget's now changed to scale, so I can scale it in whatever direction I want it to be. Control Z to undo. Now we've got the active pose tool. This object doesn't have any bones, so the active pose tool isn't going to do anything. So there's not much point in going into too much depth on there. And then the animate to tool is much the same. Because we're not using a character, we're just using a geometric object. Not a lot's going to happen there. The next useful one to us is the surface tool. And as you can see, when I hover over it and I select it, I get a nice orange outline, nice yellow outline around the surface that I have selected. Because this object only has one surface, i.e. every single face consists of the same surface properties, there is only one selection to be made here. However, if I quickly use the geometry editor tool and I select that face, I'm going to right click, and you don't have to worry about how I'm doing this. This is something we'll talk about later, but we've got that selected, and we're going to assign geometry assignment. We're going to create a surface from selected, and we're just going to call it 2. Accept. Now you can see a second surface property has appeared in the surface tab for our cube object. Now if I use the surface selection tool, I select the whole object, or rather the bit that's not contained within that surface, and do selecting default, and you can see there's an orange outline around this face, or rather the orange outline is around the rest of the object which still has the default surface on it. This face isn't selected. If I click on that, now the orange outline is around this cube, and we can set the properties for each face differently if we want to. So I can just change this. I'm going to change the base color, and I'm just going to glow this one red. Click OK, and now as you can see, I've got 1 red face and 2 white faces, or 5 white faces if we're being pedantic, like so. So that's quite a handy thing to have. Now then, the next tool is the region navigator tool. Don't worry too much about that one for now. We'll talk about that another time. Then we've got the joint editor tool. That's useful for rigging. Then we've got the weight brush tool, which is useful for also rigging, but also for deforce. Again, we'll cover those topics in later videos when we get into the slightly more advanced stuff. As you've already seen me use, the geometry editor tool allows me to select faces, vertexes or vertices, and lines on our object. So if I have cube selected, currently I've got the face tool selected, but I can also right click and I can change to edge selection. So I can select a specific edge, which is a little more difficult because edges are very small. like so. And then we've got the vertex selection, which is even more difficult using this particular tool, but we can switch to marquee or lasso selection. So if I go with lasso selection, you can see I can select a single vertex one at a time. And then that just allows us to manipulate certain things about the shape. Now, this does not allow us to move these things. We cannot manipulate the shape of this object. All we can do is delete faces and we can flip normals. So I can turn this into a box with no lid on it, but I can't move the lid. That would have to be a separate object, which is then rigged, attached to this one that rotates. So you can create complex objects using Daz Studio geometry, but it is really not very easy to do compared to just whipping over into Blender and doing it that way. So knowing the limitations of Daz Studio will help you create better renders. Now, something that we didn't talk in the last video about, which is kind of relevant to today's topic, which is composition, is lighting multiple objects. So I'm going to give you a demonstration. I'm going to duplicate this node again, edit, copy or duplicate nodes, and then I'm going to move this object, and I'm going to move it to here, like so. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another object. This time it's going to be a sphere, and it's going to be fairly small. In fact, no, let's make this 1 meter. There we go. And we're going to grab our sphere and we're going to bring this one out this way and then up a little bit to about there. And I'm just going to quickly turn this into a light source. Don't worry too much about copying me for this bit. This is just to demonstrate the situation that we're in. And if I jump to NVIDIA iRay preview mode, what we should see, if I go to my render settings quickly, I'll just show you what I'm doing. I'm in my render settings tab, going to here, and I'm changing my environment from dome and scene to scene only. Going to turn my draw ground off because there's no need for that. And then now what you can see is that the only light source in our scene is this sphere. Now what you can see here, aside from the fact that this cube is creating a shadow on this one, so if we wanted to fix that, we can just drag this up a little bit. There you go. This cube is much more brightly lit than this one, or at least it's more brightly lit. And this is because we're using the square rule, by which I mean if you double the distance from the light source, you get a quarter of the power. So looking at this from side on, what we can see is it's not quite double the distance. If we was to move this about that far away, it's now getting a quarter of the power, which is suboptimal, I think you will agree. What we would like is for this to be equally as lit as that one. Now we could create another light source, but what that's going to do is create more light on top of this object. So we have to think of another solution. And the solution is actually really simple, because we are talking about relativity. Not Albert Einstein's relativity, but kind of similar. The light source here relative to this object, this light source relative to this object is twice or half as far away as this object. So it's going to get a quarter of the power. Now, if any of you are maths whiz, what you will know is that if I do not change the object distance between each other, if I leave that as the probably 2 meters that it currently is, but I move this further away and increase the intensity, the relative difference between the distance from the light source to this object and the distance from the light source to this object decreases, and therefore they become more evenly lit. So let's zoom out. Let's go nice and far away. Let's do it in texture shaded mode so it's not quite so slow. I'm going to select our cube, and this time I'm going to drag it all the way over here. And now I'm going to boost the power. I need to do that, otherwise we're not going to be able to see a damn thing. So I'm just going to add a couple of zeros to my intensity. Now I'm going to come back to over here, switch to NVIDIA iRay preview mode. And if I swing my camera around to here so you can see both the faces, what you can see is now they're much more evenly lit. Much more evenly. In fact, you could, to the naked eye, apart from the top face obviously being not lit on this cube because it's higher up, you could argue that they're actually identically lit now. And that is because the relative difference away from the light source is significantly less. So if you're trying to create a scene where you've got multiple characters and you don't want to fill your scene with light sources, which will, in the grand scheme of things, slow down your render times because you're having to do more calculations, you can use this trick, move the light source further away, make it brighter, and then you'll get more evenly lit objects. Nice and simple. Also, what you'll notice is, currently we're in perspective view, but if I were to create a camera, I'm going to come right over towards this object. In fact, I'm going to switch to texture shaded mode, reset my view, and then I'm going to come down here. With my camera currently where it is, and I'm going to pop a camera here just for the sake of simplicity. Camera there, what you'll notice is that because of perspective, this cube appears much more large than that one. So if I jump into there, this one you could argue looks like it's twice the size of this one. Which, you know, fair enough, okay, not a problem. But if I were to move, I've gone the wrong way, let's Control Z that, let's go back into perspective view. Okay, let's come back down here. I don't know what I did there, but it was wrong, whatever it was. Let's come back down here. And I'm going to just tilt my camera up. Don't know why I switched that off. I'm going to pop this back here. Going to pop a camera here, but I'm not going to jump into it. And now I'm going to back away. Let's stay as close to the floor as possible. And I'm going to come to about here and create another camera. And create that one. Hit accept. Now I'm going to jump into this camera and I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to come back to camera 2, sorry. You see much further away. Camera properties. I'm going to zoom in so that they're both still framed up in my shot. And like so. Now what you can see is the cubes look almost identical in size. There's a very subtle difference between the two. But compared to this shot, bear in mind they're the same cubes. What I've done is I've moved further away and I've zoomed in. And what I've done is I've effectively, in this view, we're getting a distorted view of reality because we're seeing this one that's much nearer and this one's much further away. And because we're not seeing in stereoscopic view, we're seeing a single two-dimensional image, this cube looks like it's twice the size of this one. And in order to remedy that, what I've done is I've moved much further away and I've zoomed in. And now the cubes appear. Now we're seeing the true proportions of the object. So this is another handy little trick that you can use. As well as giving us evenly lit cubes, we're also getting equally sized cubes now. Much better perspective. So that's another trick that you can use when you're taking pictures of characters. If you're in a boxed room with solid walls, then unfortunately you're going to be limited to how much of this technique that you can use, because you're going to be clipping through walls and whatnot. But if you're in an outdoor environment, an open environment where you have the ability to zoom the camera right out and move the light sources further away, you can solve some of these really simple problems just by doing that. Move further away, zoom in, move the light source further away and increase the intensity, and that creates a much more balanced and undistorted view of the real world. And this also applies to characters. If I've got a character in the scene and I move the camera further away and zoom in, it gives me a much less distorted view of that person rather than a really weird one, which is something that I'm going to demonstrate right now. So here we have a character loaded into our scene, and I'm going to put two cameras in. What I want is a close-up of this character's face. You wouldn't think that'd be too complicated, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to slide myself over towards her face, and you can see because of the geometry on the character already getting a little bit jerky. So let's just go to mesh resolution and drop the sub D level down, and that's just going to smooth things up a tiny little bit for us. Right, so close up of the character's face, going to pop my first camera just here, like so. I jump into that camera view, can maneuver this camera nice and close to get just the top of her head cropped off and the shoulders. I'm going to rotate a smidge just so that it's a little bit better composed there, like so. Nice and simple like that. Now I'm going to jump into my perspective view and I'm going to come way back over here. In fact, you know what I'm going to do to make life easier is I'm going to create the camera, going to apply default settings, and then I'm going to Control C that camera. I'm going to paste it to Control V this camera, but this time I'm going to move this about 2,000, that's 20 meters away. And then when I jump into that camera, as you can see now, all I need to do is rotate my view so that it's actually pointing at her face. And then if we come to, I want to move it slightly over this way so that we're getting more or less the same kind of angle on her, which is probably round about here, pretty much perfectly behind there now. And if I zero in on her, now I'm going to select camera and I'm going to zoom right in. Loads, really long lens this one. even more so. That 2000mm lens, could you imagine having a 2 meter long camera lens? So we're at more or less the same crop, give or take. Now if I jump back into our other camera again, what we're going to see is how much more distorted or different her face, how much different her face looks from this far away. And if I go into NVIDIA Iron mode, I can kind of re-emphasize the point. The purpose of this is to just demonstrate how distorted the face looks when you're close up. Now Daz Studio is going to have a bit of a think, because it's Daz Studio and that's what it does. And it's going to give us a nice render of this character's face. We currently have no light sources in the scene anyway, so I'm just going to quickly turn our scene back into dome and scene only, and now you can see her face. Now, this doesn't look that bad. She's an attractive lady, the clothes fit, the hair looks good and all that, until I jump to our other camera. And you can see she almost looks like a different person, because this is the undistorted view. If I hide this camera, if I hide that camera from view as well, so that they're no longer obstructing our view, this is what she actually looks like in real life. Still an attractive lady, still wearing the same clothes, still nice haircut. But now when I jump back to this view, you can suddenly see now how distorted this version of her looks. Because we're so much closer, we're right close up and we're zoomed out so that we can see as much of her as we want to see. Whereas if we go further away and zoom in, we get the undistorted version of what she looks like. So again, another useful tip for when you're composing your scenes is, if you're in a position where you can, zoom out as far away as you can get. Obviously, don't go mad. You don't need to go hundreds and hundreds of meters away. Usually sort of 5 to 10 meters away is fine. I've gone about 20 meters away just to sort of overemphasize the point. But going a reasonable distance away and zooming in to get your shot is going to give you a much more attractive, much less distorted shot of the model. So some pretty useful things there to remember. Nice and simple, so things that you can build on from your last lesson. In the next episode, we're probably going to look at actually loading in characters, posing them, and things like that. But in this episode, all we've done is we've covered some of the more basic, fundamental topics that are going to make your renders look a lot better. Thanks very much for watching that, guys. I hope you found that useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm sure you will. And I will see you in the next one. But until then, you take damn good care of yourselves, alright? Bye-bye.